Right, guys, welcome back to Unit 3, Outcome 2, Key Knowledge 6, where we're talking about performance management. Here is the snapshot of the study design, and here is where this one sits. And you can see in here, again, we have a script, performance management strategies to achieve both business and employee objectives, including, and then it gives us 4 actual strategies. So once again, if you Googled performance management strategies, that's not the only ones you're going to come up with, but these are the ones identified in the study design. These are the ones that you can be asked about. These are the ones you need to know about, and these are the ones I'm going to cover in this video. Straightforward. So first off, before we get into those strategies, performance management, what even is it? What do we mean by performance management? Look, there's a couple of definitions for you. This is one of those terms that is defined in so many different ways. Obviously, if you are coming up with the definition, don't put it's managing the performance of people, because we're using the words. But really, that's kind of what it is. You've got a team of people, and the idea is you have a system, a structure in place, which allows you to kind of monitor how well your employees are doing, and kind of ideally gives them feedback in how they can improve. So that basically you've got all of your people performing as best they can at all times. That's kind of the idea behind this, okay? And once we've done this, that'll kind of be put into more context, I guess. But look, there's a couple of different definitions of performance management as a whole that would work. Okay, so why is it important to do this? Okay, so what are the benefits of having a really well-structured performance management system in place? And you'll find pretty much all large businesses do. Most medium businesses probably do, probably not so much small businesses, like a lot of this sort of HR stuff. But if you do this in the right way, which is the idea behind this video, show you ways in which it can be done. If you can link individual objectives to the organizational objectives, you should basically be able to maximize the performance of both the employees and the business. And this idea of linking objectives, so the employee objectives with the organization, I guess the theory behind that is that people are probably going to be more driven, more motivated by achieving their own objectives, regardless of what you say about, sort of for the greater good and for the business. But I guess the idea is if you can set things in such a way that in achieving their own objectives, getting where they want to get to, achieving what they want to do, the business thereby achieves its objectives. That's kind of a really neat, good way of doing this. As we'll find out, not easy to do often, but if you can do that, great way to do it. Another advantage, if we're doing this again in the right way, it means we've got everyone pulling in the same direction. Okay, rather than having everyone kind of going off doing their own thing, going in different directions. Imagine a footy team. A footy team works best when we're all playing together, playing as a team. If everyone's doing their own thing, obviously it kind of all falls apart. Exactly the same in a business, no different. These systems, as we'll find out, or these strategies, there's a lot of focus on communication between managers and employees, okay? There's a lot of dialogue involved between those two stakeholder groups. We've talked about this before, but anything that encourages dialogue, encourages communication between managers and employees in a business is always a good thing. And finally, going through this process or these processes, it can provide some really useful information to managers, which they then use to make other decisions about particular employees kind of moving forward. And to demonstrate some examples of that, this diagram here. So basically, once we've gone through our performance management process, it can lead to decisions being made about each employee, for example, around these things here. So training and development, start at the bottom left corner. The feedback or the information that comes out of our performance management process, or the combination of strategies that we use, might identify that this particular employee requires some further training and development. And once you know that allows you then to put that into place. I guess without having the performance management processes in place, that information might not kind of come out, and then it's not known, and then that training and development is not going to happen. Termination, this is a kind of a tricky one. We cover termination in a later key knowledge dot point in this outcome. So we'll talk about it in more detail then, but you can't just terminate someone's employment right off the bat if they're not performing. You have to go through a process of allowing to improve, giving them support, all that sort of thing. There has to be kind of a process involved. But ultimately, poor performance can lead to termination. It's just not an instant thing. But again, the information that comes out of performance management process can give us at least an indicator that this might be where we're heading. And if that's the case, what it might mean as a manager is that you kind of really, it puts you kind of in mind that you absolutely need to document everything that you're doing with this particular employee really, really well and very thoroughly, because ultimately, if you go to termination and the employee kind of disagrees, they could take you to an unfair dismissal tribunal, and then it becomes very messy. And that's when you're going to rely on any documentation and evidence that you have. So it can give you the heads up, this performance management process, that if we're heading in that direction, we just need to step very carefully with this employee and document everything relating to them. Remuneration, it can lead to a pay rise. Again, depends on the system you've had. If I go back to my Macca's days, once every year we had a performance management process, and you were kind of graded on a scale of 1 to 5. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but if you scored a 5, you might have got, a 5% pay increase in your pay. If you scored a 4, it might have been 4, 3, 3, so on and so forth. But basically, the pay increase that everybody got was directly related to the information that came out of the performance management process. So that can also be the case. Promotion, it might identify that this particular employee is, ready for promotion. So then you need to start looking at the next opportunity for them. Or it might even identify they're not ready for promotion now, but this is someone who is looking for those opportunities in the future. And then that puts you in mind of, okay, so you've identified someone that's looking for these opportunities. You might start then thinking about some training and development that you could offer them over a period of time that is going to kind of help them get to where they want to go. So that can work in a bunch of different ways. Transfers, a little bit random, but look, it might identify people that might be better suited to working in a different division, department, or team within the business. So you could transfer them still within the business, but to another area of the business. Disciplinary procedures, this might be sort of linked to termination, but the information that comes out of your performance management process might lead you down the path of this person. There's some kind of disciplinary procedures that we need to follow with regards to this employee. So lots and lots of useful information can come out of this process, but again, only if it's a really thorough, robust performance management process, which is what we're going to look at putting together when we look at these strategies. Now, another thing just to bear in mind and put out there is that whichever of these 4 strategies is being used, and actually, I'll just put out there now that there's 4 strategies that we look at, those ones identified in the study design. It's not to say that you use just one of them, okay? You can use a combination of one or more, even all of them. And some businesses do use a combination of all 4 of these. So it's not that you just use one of these strategies standalone. They kind of work well together, as will become kind of more evident when you look at what they are. But whichever strategies you're putting in place, whether it's 1, 2, 3, or 4 of them, the whole process has to be conducted fairly and be free as far as possible from bias and based on objective evidence. Okay, it has to be a fair system, because if you think about those decisions we just looked at that are going to be made, these are fairly impactful decisions. So these have to be made off of the back of objective, actual evidence and not opinions, and definitely free from bias. And because at the end of the day, again, as we go through the systems, you'll see what I mean. But, there's people involved. And where there's people involved, there's always the potential to be bias. You need to make sure you kind of remove that bias. And it also needs to be a regular, continual process. Isn't just a one-off thing that you do once and then walk away from it. This is kind of an ongoing thing for all employees. Again, if you're doing it the right way. So the strategies, let's get on with those. So the 4 performance management strategies, there are the 4. So we'll take those in turn. First off, management by objectives. So this is a process where basically this actually looks a lot like Locke and Latham's goal setting theory. This is pretty closely related to that. So managers, employees collaboratively set some performance goals, Lock and Latham. And then at the end of the review period, is okay, so we're setting the goals today and this is when they should be achieved by. So it's usually 12 months in most businesses. It can be shorter. It could be 3 months, 6 months, 12, whatever you want it to be. But 12 months is pretty standard. So the end of that review period, the employee's performance is then assessed against those goals that you collaboratively set at the start of the period. Okay, pretty straightforward, yeah? So an assessment is made at that point on how far the employee's got in achieving those goals set at the start of the process. Okay, a really, really straightforward and simple one. I don't think there's anything too complicated to understand there. The advantages of having such a system in place, it provides objectivity. So we just talked about the need for objectivity and, objective evidence when we're making decisions about people. Well, this provides that. Because it's very black and white. Here's a goal. Did we reach it? Didn't we reach it? How close are we to reaching it? Did we overachieve it? It's a black and white. Everybody knows where we are. It provides that objectivity, which kind of meets one of the requirements of having a good, robust performance management system. Another advantage of using this one is the goals can be adjusted easily if necessary. So in other words, along the way, so if it's very evident early on that this goal was too easy or too difficult, it's possible then to kind of either rein the goal back in or extend the goal so they can be tweaked along the way. The collaborative aspect of the setting the goals and then also the feedback that you get along the way. Again, coming back to this idea of dialogue between managers and employees, okay? Always, the more dialogue we've got happening between employees and managers, just really good for workplace relations. It builds a more positive culture, builds trust between those two layers. So anything that we've got in place that is encouraging that is also a bonus. And finally, if employees are achieving goals, they get a sense of achievement, if you believe in the Lock and Latham theory that people are motivated by the achievement of goals, rather than say the Maslow, where the meeting of those needs. But if you're kind of on the Lock and Latham bus, then you feel you believe that that's how people are motivated. Then obviously, if people are motivated, they're going to feel a sense of achievement when they've met those goals. Some negative sides to this one. Look, it can be difficult or it can be kind of pointless to set goals for some jobs. Not every job is easy to set goals for. I can't think off the top of my head right now of an example of that, but look, the reality is it's just hard to do for some jobs. It's, for example, a sales job, it's kind of easy to set monetary targets. You need to sell $10,000 worth of widgets a month or whatever it might, real estate, anything to do with sales, goals are pretty easy. In a lot of other types of jobs, it's not impossible, but it just is harder to do. Another thing, where this kind of falls down often, is that businesses, managers often fail to take into account the environmental factors that have led to the employee not achieving the goals. Now, when I say environmental factors, I don't mean saving the planet, that kind of environmental. Talking about issues or things that are beyond the control of the employee. So in other words, if you've not provided the resources that they need to achieve the goals, if you've not supported or trained them in the right way. So it's only realistic to expect employees to reach goals if you basically tool them up in a way that they can achieve them. You can't put hurdles or barriers in their way by not giving them adequate training and adequate support, access to whatever resources they need. And that's where this actually does kind of often fall down in a real life situation. This also only works if there's a consistent approach to following through with the whole process. Okay, and this does involve catch-ups. Again, we go back to Lock and Latham. One of the principles of the Lock and Latham theory is the requirement there's constant feedback. So when we looked at that, we kind of went through a process. So, okay, we're setting a 12-month goal, but we'll catch up every quarter with the employee and kind of review where we're at, celebrate the small wins, maybe adjust the goals if necessarily, provide some feedback, keep them on track. This often, and again, I said in that video as well, this often kind of falls by the wayside, okay? Those progress catch-ups are often missed. Usually not the end of review meeting, because that sort of seems really important. But often these catch-ups, when a manager just kind of has a million things going on and, okay, today I'm supposed to catch up with little Johnny to, for his quarterly, catch-up meeting to talk about his goals, somehow that just becomes, it kind of flips to the bottom of a manager's priority list, where it really shouldn't, but that's reality. If you've got an issue that's facing you head on now, it needs to be dealt with. Somehow this just kind of drops to the bottom of the priority list and they kind of don't happen. So, the workaround there obviously is make sure they do, make them a priority. It's just sometimes not as easy as that. So yeah, basically at the bottom there it says it all the disadvantages associated with using the Lock and Latham goal setting theory, because that's really what we're talking about here. Okay, so the disadvantages or the negatives, the cons of using management by objectives really replicates the list of disadvantages, cons or negatives of using the Lock and Latham theory. Okay, the second one, performance appraisal. That's what they call it in the study design. In the real world, it's very often called performance review. In fact, I'd say probably more commonly called performance review. And some of you may well have gone through one of these. If you have a job, particularly in one of the larger retailers or businesses and Maccas, Coles, Woolies, Kmart, etc., they would definitely have these systems in place. And again, they would usually be on an annual basis. So this is a process that measures how well an employee has performed in their job, provides feedback to employees, and establishes plans to improve performance. And the idea here is an actual meeting between, usually should be, a meeting between the employee and the manager. Okay, so a date is set and a meeting happens where we actually discuss performance. And this is where I said before about you could use multiple of these strategies. Well, that first one, management by objectives, so that might be built into this. So part of the performance appraisal, performance review meeting is to discuss those goals and how well we went in achieving them. So that's kind of where you kind of combine these things in. So this is really talking about the actual meeting where ultimate feedback is being provided on your performance. So as well as giving information to the employee about their performance, there's some other good information that can also come out of this process as well. For example, have our staff selection procedures actually been working? And what I mean by that is if you have a team of 10 people, say, that you manage, and you sit down and you have your performance appraisal with all 10, and it turns out that none of them are performing where we expected them to be, then you might start thinking, well, is the issue not so much with them, is it more with us? Are we actually recruiting the right people in the first place? Okay, or selecting the right people? Go back to year 11 if you did that, recruitment and selection. So you might start going back further in the piece and start thinking, do we need to rethink the kind of people that we're bringing into the business? Because if none of them are performing where we're expecting them to, maybe that's the issue. Okay, so that's one question or one area that might crop up. Is our training and development effective? So again, it kind of extends from that first question. Okay, so we look at, we are recruiting the right type of people, but what we're then not doing is training and developing them effectively. Okay, so where are the gaps in our training that if we provide our employees, so we're recruiting the right people into the business, we're not training them right. Where are the gaps? What do we need to do to provide adequate training to allow these employees to be performing where we need them to be performing, basically? And then finally, this kind of comes back to that diagram with all the things going around the outside. What we need to do about remuneration, pay, reward, promotions, dismissal, and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so it opens up a general conversation, but then it kind of opens up other pathways and other areas that we need to think about more generally within the business. Look, these are just some sample performance evaluation forms, and you may well have done these. In fact, some of you might have been doing this. Example, say you're a crew trainer or a supervisor in retail or fast food. You might have actually been the person that filled one of these out on another employee. So I remember in McDonald's, we used to have these forms. It was very black and white. You would stand there and watch the employee, maybe talk to them, and you basically rate them in various areas of the job. So there's lots of these forms that are knocking about, but a lot of large businesses, particularly that recruit a lot of staff working in fairly basic jobs, they have this kind of a structure in place. And then the idea is, once you've completed this, you would sit down and talk about the results and what that means, for the employee moving forward. Now, some key points to consider with performance appraisal. Now, look, the process or the actual meeting where you're going to sit down with the employee and discuss their performance, that this, generally speaking, is a meeting that very often neither party is really looking forward to. From the employee's perspective, look, it can just be an uncomfortable process, particularly if you feel as the employee that you are not performing well and you're kind of expecting some negative feedback. That's not a nice meeting to be kind of going into, right? So that could be quite uncomfortable. For the manager's part, look, sometimes you might have a meeting scheduled, a performance appraisal meeting scheduled with the employee where the feedback is going to be largely negative. Look, unless you're some kind of a sadist, most managers don't like doing that. Yeah, that's not a pleasant meeting, even for the manager to be taking part in. If everything's all brilliant, then great. It's going to be a nicer meeting. But if you've got to discuss some quite tricky areas and point out some negative things, that's not pleasant. So basically, these meetings, the reality is usually there's a mix of positive and negative feedback. But I guess what I'm getting at here is that the meeting is generally something that at least one party, but often both parties, is not something they're relishing doing. So the idea is to make it as comfortable as possible. So the way I used to do this when I was managing a team of recruiters on Collins Street in the CBD. So I had 17 recruiters when the team was at its largest. So I'd have to go through this process with each of them. And look, there were some uncomfortable discussions to be had. Rather than doing it at work, we'd go for a coffee. We'd go to a cafe down the street, chill out a bit and have a coffee, maybe something to eat, and do it in that environment. It just kind of takes the edge off of it, makes it a little bit more comfortable, takes some of the formality out of it. And although you can have the same chat, it just makes it an all-round more comfortable situation. So that's one way you could do this. You can use, one thing to point out, you can use written or oral feedback. Look, I would say never use just written. So if you go back to those examples of the forms that I just showed you, it's not a good idea just to fill in one of those with some written comments and just give it to them, and that's the end of the process. Okay, you need the chance to discuss it. So I'd say if you use written feedback, some systems would, some won't. But even if there is written feedback involved, you still need to be having a discussion about that written feedback and, give the employee a chance to respond and give their side and, just have a discussion about that written feedback. So I don't think it's a good idea to just have written, but you can have a mix of both. Again, this I've already talked about, but the idea is the actual review is usually annual, but the process is ongoing. So this idea of feedback, coming back to Locke and Nathan feedback, that's really, really key. Like I said, it is one area where this the whole process kind of can fall down. Okay, sample process. Okay, just to kind of give you a bit more of an idea maybe about how this might look. So in December, we're coming towards the end of the year. Okay, that is when you sit down with each employee and collaboratively you set some goals with each employee for the following year. So, okay, we're in December 2022, right? It was the end of last year, December 2022. We sit down, with each employee, work out some goals that they're going to try to achieve throughout 2023. You do that. Okay, come back in January after the Christmas break, and we sign off and agree on all goals. So we just finalize that goal setting process. Then in April, you have your Q1 checkpoint, your quarter one checkpoint. And this is a progress check. How are we traveling? So again, you're going to have a meeting with each employee. You've got their goals there that you agreed to 3 months previously. And you have the discussion, the feedback session with each employee about how they're travelling towards those goals. Okay, is there any corrective action that we need to take to get you back on path to achieving those goals? And at this point, celebrate the small wins. If they're on track or if they're exceeding expectations, celebrate those small wins, give them a pump up. This is a chance for some really positive feedback for the employee. July. So now we're doing a Q2 or H1, half one checkpoint. Same process at Q1, okay? This is the continual feedback. October, we're going to do the same for Q3. And then in December, we have our final performance review of the year, where we'll agree on ratings, if that's part of the process. Those decisions made around pay increases, bonuses, training, promotions, all of those things are made. Employees given the opportunity to respond. And then the process starts again. So then we're going to set some goals for 2024 and the process continues. So that's what I mean by it being a continual process. Okay, positives to do this one. Communication always improves workplace relations. I've said that several times now. That's definitely key here. It allows problem areas to be highlighted, so areas for improvement. And therefore allows management to put support structures in place to resolve those issues. Because if we weren't going through this process, we might, never uncover those problem areas and they're just going to continue. It also assists with succession planning through identifying strong performance, the management future. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but just so where succession planning is thinking about the management of the business moving forward. What you don't want to happen is to have, say, a bunch of managers resign at the same time and find that you don't have anybody within the business that are kind of ready to take over the reins and take on that responsibility. So when you're running a business, you always need to be looking ahead and making sure that, under each level of management, you have people who are kind of ready to jump into those positions should the necessity arise, I guess. So this process is going to help you identify these strong performers who are potentially going to, jump into those roles in the future. Negatives. Look, employees can become demotivated. They've received multiple negative reviews, and that can lead to them leaving. So in other words, staff turnover. Look, there's skills you would learn as a manager in ways to deliver feedback. Okay, there's the sandwich. So if you have to deliver a negative message, you kind of start with a positive, then deliver the negative and finish with a positive. There's various names for that, some of which I can't say in this video, but there's ways of delivering this. You can be quite skillful in how you deliver a negative message to make it not sound quite so negative, but still get the message across. Can be time consuming because individual meetings are needed, not just for that end of a review, but for all of those, the Q1, Q2, Q3 catch ups. So it is very time consuming. And an issue you may have is that some of these high performers that you identify amongst the staff, they might be expecting some kind of reward in return. You've identified them as being high performing. They've got a really good performance review rating. They might be expecting promotions and that sort of thing. But opportunities might be limited at that point in time. As you go up through a business, there's less and less people at each level, obviously. So you might be limited by the opportunities, actually available within the business. Okay, so if that happens, it can result in demotivation on the part of those staff, or even competitors benefiting from your process because they'll seek employment with one of them instead of sticking with you because they feel there's nowhere for them to go with you. So just things to be aware of. Self-evaluation. What it says on the tin, but I'm going to take it a little bit further. So this is something that also can be incorporated into most performance management systems, and it might even be the first step in the review process. Now, like I said, what it says on the tin, this is basically the employee assessing their own performance against some agreed goals set at the start of the period. This is really good because it gives the manager an understanding of the employee's perception of their own performance, and that can be really, really valuable. And what often happens is that actually the employee's perception of themselves is more harsh than what yours as the manager is. I've found that to be the case very often. You actually think, they're at a certain level, and people are kind of more harsh on themselves. I mean, obviously there's some pretty arrogant people out there that always think they're the bee's knees. But the reality is most people, they would judge themselves more harshly than what others do, which is interesting. So managers can gain an insight into employees' understanding of their own strengths and weaknesses. That's a really valuable insight to have as a manager. Again, it helps you understand what makes the person tick. Just anything that gives you a deeper understanding of that person, where they're coming from, is just really helpful when you're managing them. And uncovering any weaknesses, again, can lead to further training opportunities. So it might be that from your perspective, a certain aspect of them doing their job is great, no dramas, but they feel that they're weak. And you wouldn't necessarily be aware of that if you're not gained this self-evaluation. So this is where this type of information, again, can be really valuable, because by going through this process, it can uncover stuff that otherwise you would not have been aware of. A negative, I guess, look, employees might be dishonest or biased towards themselves, of their own opinions. And if that is really the case, then how valuable, how useful actually is this information? But I would say, look, realistically, that usually is not. I've not come across too many instances of that over the years. Okay, final strategy, employee observation. And again, stress, not in isolation. This can be used in combination with all the others. Now, look, this seems very simple, but I'm just going to add something else to this one. Employees' performance is evaluated by actually watching them do the job. Yeah, employee observation. Okay, very straightforward. So you as the manager could physically stand there and watch the person doing particular aspects of the job and make a judgment about how well they're doing it. Okay, that's employee observation in its most simple form. But if you wanted to extend a response about this one, now what I'm going to talk about isn't mentioned in the study design, but this is a way you could extend a response about employee observation. And it's by doing this, by doing a 360-degree survey. Okay, so if you're going to talk about employee observation, you wanted to get small marks, this is one way you could extend your response. A 360-degree survey. Look, I'm going to focus on the diagram that you see in the middle of the screen there. This is basically where you collect feedback from a range of different stakeholders who all interact with that particular employee. Okay, this is what's called 360 degrees. Okay, first off, you're going to collect information from their line manager. You're then going to collect information from any peers they have. So in other words, people that work alongside them in the organization, the same level alongside them. Clients, potentially, if they deal with clients, you can also get information from external clients. And then also, if they are a people manager themselves, you can actually get information from their direct report. So in other words, the people that they manage. So that's why it's called a 360-degree survey, because you're collecting from people that work above them, below them, and to the side of them. So get this idea of 360-degree. Now, if you think about that, that is a lot of different types of opinion from a different range of different stakeholders. That can be much more valuable than just seeking, I guess, feedback in the traditional way, which would have been just the line manager. Okay, particularly if the relationship between the line manager and the employee is not the best. We talked at the beginning about how the results of all of this must be free from bias. And look, if the relationship isn't the best, this is kind of a way of removing some bias, or at least leveling it out by getting the opinions of lots of different people. Just gives you, look, I've worked in a couple of businesses that go through this process. It's a pretty full-on process. And again, you kind of can feel like you're being judged by lots of people, but it does give really, really valuable information. People have different opinions. So this is a really good holistic way to collect information from an employee observation point of view. Now, another thing to point out about employee observation, you can do this with the employee knowing or without them knowing. So, for example, you might have a pre-arranged observation session where the employee knows that you're going to come and watch, or it can happen via things like mystery shopper or mystery diner reports. So, for example, McDonald's, they're constantly sending out mystery diners into restaurants. You don't know who they are when you're feeding; they're just acting like a normal customer. But unbeknownst to you, they could then, making an assessment of the service they receive, the quality of the food, all that sort of thing, which is then fed back to the business. So that's kind of one way to do it. So different ways to do this. But yeah, employee observation, key thing there, because employee observation, there isn't too much to talk about. So that's why I say, like, if you wanted to extend your response, you could go down the route of talking about the 360-degree survey and how that's a better way or a more holistic way of collecting that type of information. Positives here, using feedback from a broad range of sources. I've just kind of said that. More reliable, more useful, more holistic. And also, I guess employees might be more responsive to feedback from other sources. So they might be more responsive to feedback from their peers than from their manager. And again, that might depend on the relationships between those various stakeholders, but that certainly can be the case. A negative, it can lead to misleading results if the employee is aware they're being observed. So in other words, if you do your job, a certain way, but you're being watched, you might then kind of artificially increase your performance for that period of time you're being watched. And then as soon as the observer's gone away, you go back to how you normally do it. So there is that aspect, which is why probably doing it without knowledge is probably more realistic or more accurate. Can lead to employees feeling stressed if they're aware they're being observed. That's definitely a thing. If you feel there's someone watching over your shoulder, and then, you might actually make mistakes because you're stressed that you wouldn't usually make, because you've got this kind of artificial situation going on, which is just stressing you out. So there's that issue. May introduce bias. So I've said 360 could kind of reduce bias because you're taking more than one opinion, but there can be bias that enters the process because, say, for example, your peers. So if they are talking to the people that you work alongside, your peers in the business, and getting feedback from them, you might be in a situation where you and them are all chasing the next management opportunity that crops up. So although you work alongside them and with them, you're in the same team, there's an element of competition because you're chasing the next promotion. Then you've got to think about the feedback that's coming from those people. Is there some bias in there? Are they going to maybe say negative things because they think if they say positive things, you're going to get the job instead of them? So again, these are all just things you need to be aware of, take into account and think about when you're running these types of processes. That is it for performance management, guys. So quite a lot we talked about there. Get a really good set of notes. I've talked about a lot of stuff there that wasn't written down. A lot of that stuff is really important that you do have a note of and it goes into there. Look, that's it. I'll leave you for now. I'll see you in the next video for Key Knowledge 7. Cheers for now.